I was around 8 years old when I realized, as did my family, that I had a unique memory. Photographic, they called it. It's really nothing like a photograph, though. I always assumed everyone could recall their first day of preschool, the names of the kids they met only once at the arcade. But at 11 years old, my sister Cammie was chosen for a game show on the radio. Without hesitation, she chose me as her roommate to bring with. She could have chosen either of our parents, even our older brother Charlie, who was in college. She could have picked one of her friends, 8th graders like her. But she chose me. I remember sitting around the kitchen table, eating dinner, the pitch-black Midwestern winter night just outside the giant kitchen window behind my dad. He and my mom were totally supportive of the idea. He had offered even to drive us to the radio station. "I would have chosen you too, Bobby," my mom said, laughing. "You remember every weird fact ever." And it was true. I could close my eyes and see every house my parents had ever brought us to. I could draw the floor plan of them if I wanted to. My siblings would ask me to retell stories or movie plots on long car rides. But it wasn't until the radio show, and my sister choosing me as her person, that I knew I had something special. I can still remember going to bed that night after dinner, feeling excited. I finally fell asleep, pressed up against the wall that divided me from my sister's room, her voice through the vents above my bed, saying good night like she did every night. The smell of dust on the furnace, the sound of old creaking boards directly above me in the attic. It was the last night I was happy to have my amazing memory. To this day, I wish I could forget what happened next. I wish I could tell you we won the game show. I wish I could tell you with incredible detail what it was like at the studio. Maybe then, when I close my eyes, that's what I would see, not the black, whipping night blurring past me as I ran. I would feel the rush of anticipation and my sister's hand squeezing mine, instead of cold, wet gravel scraping my cheeks and palms when I tried to crawl away on 2 sprained ankles. I would hear the producers cue the canned audience laughter, not the frantic, desperate flapping of leather wings as they neared. Maybe I would have won a t-shirt that still sits in my dresser. Maybe my sister would have won the $1,000 prize. Maybe I would sleep with my door unlocked. I'll never know. What I do know, without a shadow of a doubt, is that I would not have survived any of this if my family hadn't believed me. To this day, it's the thing I am most grateful for in the entire world. It was the day after dinner, on Tuesday, February 17th. School had been agonizingly slow, as I knew it would be all week waiting for Friday. It was all we could talk about on the way home. For years, I'd waited for school with Yuki and my best friend Dominic, who lived on the street perpendicular to mine. The creek crossed under Sistrine Drive and wound its way along Dominic's backyard. There are hundreds of childhood memories in my head, of he and I and our siblings jumping over the creek, building bridges from his yard over the creek to the field behind the rec center, sliding on the ice in the winter, or half-assed fishing and turtle catching in the summer. I always envied my friends who could walk right from their backyard and into the little winding creek. It was cold, but it hadn't snowed in a few weeks. There were still some small patches of ice on the sidewalk, but most of it had melted, along with the slurry gray mounds of stale snow along the curbs and in small scattered patches on the grass. There was massive construction happening on the other side of the creek. They were building a stupid business center on the field we used to play kickball in, the crane visible between 2 houses behind us. Snow was due that weekend, and everything would be coated and beautiful again. The downside of a blanket of snow was the eerie quiet it caused, and how hard it was to sleep at night when the moonlight and the snow were so bright, even with your closed eyes. It was nearly 6 p.m., and the mid-February sky was already darkening. We had stopped under the flickering gold streetlight at the corner of Citrine and Amethyst, the street that I lived on. I remember huddling close in a group, talking. I remember the wind picking up and the edge of the sky glowing purple behind the house along Citrine. This was when my oldest brother, on break for 1 more week, drove up to the corner in Mom's old sedan. "Hey, Bobby," he called, giving my friends a little wave that they all returned. He was returning some jeans to the mall and wanted me to come with him. It was rare that Charlie asked me to do anything. I think about that a lot. Had he paid more attention to me before that night, would I have gotten in the car? Would things have been different? I think about all the choices I made that led to that happening, but none as much as the decision to get in the car with my older brother instead of walking home that evening. Maybe I wouldn't sleep in my closet. Maybe I'd have a family of my own. I'll never know. Then again, maybe I would have never seen Charlie again. If you asked, I could tell you every moment on that trip to the mall. The conversation we had, mainly Charlie asking if things fit him or were flattering. Charlie had come out to our parents a few months ago. They were not surprised or fazed. He had told me that night that he had gone to the bar and felt underdressed, and now he felt pressured to be fashionable. The last thing Charlie said to me before we got in the damn car was, "It's funny, even if you're different, there's still pressure to be the same." At 8:53 p.m. on Tuesday, February 17th, 1998, Charlie and I were on the front seat of our mother's 1995 maroon Lamino. We were at the final stop sign on the ride home, and it was 38 degrees outside. Pearl Jam's Tin was in the CD player, and we were at the corner of Pondside and Citrine, about to turn left into our neighborhood, and to home, to be with our family. Our mother had lasagna waiting for us. We were third in line at the three-way stop sign. On Charlie's side of the street was Yuki's house, with pretty lanterns lining the paved path to the courtyard of their U-shaped ranch home. On my side, past my window, was the pond. The path that led around the pond and up the hill was bright at the edge from the streetlights, but quickly faded to black, with only the occasional twinkle of a back porch light in the distance. The remains of the moon tower, built in the 70s, were barely discernible against the sky, only via the absence of stars and the shape of the structures that was only recognizable to those of us who grew up there. It was a scene that had made me feel small and afraid countless times. The cold radiating from the windows made me feel even more anxious, though now I realized that it was the adrenaline, an ancient alarm system going off in my bloodstream, survival mode manifesting in goosebumps, and what I mistook for heebie-jeebies. The black of the moon tower against the blue-black of the sky shifted as my eyes started to adjust. I had thought about a sleepover game Dominic and I had played when we were in 3rd grade, staring at each other's faces in the dark until they morphed and changed and threw us into giggle fits. It wasn't until the bottom left star above the hill disappeared that I realized it wasn't my eyes playing tricks on me. It wasn't until the pitch grew larger that I opened my mouth to say something. Charlie was deep in the chorus of Even Flow and never heard it coming. It was a low whistle, like an old man out for a walk. 2 notes, one high, one low. It repeated again, louder, and I'd turned to tell Charlie when I saw the red light of the brake lights on the car in front of us fade from his face, and he finally saw what was coming. Only, it hadn't come from the pitch black over the pond. It came from the other side, slamming into the driver's side of the car in front of us. It shattered the glass into a hailstorm, crashing onto our windshield. The impact was so intense that both left wheels had lifted off the ground. Charlie initially cursed loudly and went to open the door to help. I'd screamed at him not to, but I barely got a word out before a penetrating silent vacuum filled the air around me, sucking the air out of my lungs. Seconds later, my windows were shattered over me, glass sticking in my cheeks and the wind whipping the blood across my face and into my mouth as I screamed. I knew before I opened my eyes that it wasn't just an accident, that there was no car or bike or even human assailant. I knew before I pried my eyes open that everything I had feared as a child, that all the myths and legends and ghost stories, were real. I knew it wasn't a bat or a bird. I knew as I felt frantic claws at the nylon remains of my seatbelt that it was a monster. Not a cute storybook monster, but an ancient, angry, bitter creature. One that had been there long before I had, or the town had, or even people had. The last thing I saw before I felt the hook sink into my shoulder and I was lifted into the black, swirling cold was Charlie, slumped over the steering column, Eddie Vinder's voice still calling out to me, until I couldn't hear him anymore. Not for 1 second did I think it was a dream. The cold made sure of that. My legs heavily dragged across the broken glass of the car window, ripping my jeans and slamming my legs into the frame. I knew it was real. The biting night sky whipped around me as I violently sank a few feet as the hooks in my shoulder began to slip. I experienced a new level of pain as I felt jagged talons piercing my side, and I folded forward as I was yanked backwards into the pitch. I felt another agonizing piercing on the side of my torso before being yanked up away from the earth and everything I'd ever known. I was pulled into the pitch past the streetlights, but whatever had me was struggling. I fell 20 feet onto the icy hard gravel path, but wasn't freed. Violent metallic screams flooded my ears, and the bones of my forehead and chin were scraped along the gravel path. I desperately clawed at the earth, trying to find anything to grip, but only found fistfuls of gravel and goose crap. The talons in my side ripped out suddenly, and I felt a sickening oozing from my sides. I tried to roll over to my knees, but the pain on each side was horrible, and I felt bile swelling in my throat. A patch of dirty snow was inches away, and I tried to crawl towards it to get some ice on my bleeding injuries. That was when I felt leathery whips on my face and violent snags in my hair, pulling and snapping. My stomach lurched as again I was yanked up into the night, higher into my own icy black death. I tried desperately to grasp onto whatever had me, terrified to fall as we climbed higher. The cold stung my raw shoulders and hips, and I felt my blood freezing. The deep scrapes on my knees and face burned with the wind, feeling like icy razors scraping my cheekbones. My numb fingers found a thick, velvety limb. Coarse hair bristled and slipping under my blood. 6 daggers dug into my skull and neck. Even over the roar of the wind and the pounding of the wings, I could hear a horrible scraping and squealing of claws on my skull from behind. From the inside. I struggled to breathe, blood and vomit filling my mouth and tears threatening to suffocate me. Suddenly, the little air that I had on my lungs was forced out violently as my midsection was slammed into the highest beam of the moon tower. The crunching of my ribs was unmistakable. My vision and even my own thoughts darkened with what I can only describe as wetness. Later, I would be told that my ribs were so violently broken that they had pierced my lungs. For a moment, the moon illuminated my nightmares. I was nauseatingly high up, one eye swollen shut, but I could see the frozen pond, dull and distant. Closer, I could see a row of houses, their windows glowing but cruelly out of each. One house still had its Christmas lights up, complete with a giant light-up plastic mold Santa Claus tied to their chimney. It felt wrong and cruel, a warm and happy impossibility. I looked down to see a stream of my blood pouring from my body in a steady flow, then broken by an aggressive gust of icy wind. I choked on a scream, and I was grabbed again, talons stretching out of the exit wound in my shoulder, birthing brand new ones on my lower back. I couldn't hear my own screams over the wind and the angry metallic shrieks like barbed wire on a rusted trampoline. I remember at this point I could see the pond shrinking south of me as once again my host struggled with its prey. Suddenly we dropped right above the creek, my legs slamming into the fence surrounding the construction site. The cranes loomed over us, the 2 security floodlights at its base finally providing light. The construction site was deep in the ground, a parking garage with a basement level built to be tornado-proof. I've heard countless times from other people with violent experiences Did they forget chunks of their trauma, or they blacked it out? I try not to seethe with jealousy. If I could forget any of it, I would want to forget what I saw under those garish white construction lights. I can remember every tiny, ice-cold pebble digging into my skin, the shimmering bouquet of my tear-soaked lashes, the gritty, jagged pain of my pulverized rib bones. I remember the smell, a mix of cold sweat, like when our dad would come home after his jog, diesel, blood. There was another smell coming from the base of the crane, sickly sweet, like almond extract gone bad. Behind the crane was a trailer. The paneling was beige and a huge green tin sign that read, Argon Construction. I thought for a moment that a phone might be inside. I pulled myself up onto my knees and looked around. It was difficult since my left eye was useless, and my right one was full of tears and blood. My assailant was nowhere in sight. I thought that maybe it had gotten injured or caught on a fence. Stupid. I know now that it simply was rousing its companions, because it was dinner time. I was an offering, like when my cat Nala would bring me dead robins. Here I was, with my wings clipped. I was halfway to the trailer, limping as fast as I could, every step excruciating, breathing like there were pins and needles in me. Even with my sobbing hyperventilation, I heard it. I hear it now. I can always hear it. The two-toned whistle, haunting and dreadful, like even if I hadn't been at death's door, that tone would still have shaken me, like a doomsday alarm, like useless sirens wailing as meteors crash into the boiling sea. Under the whistle, a thick, wet breath, echoing from beneath the base of the crane, a dark recess in the cold, wet ground, with darkness somehow leaking from it. Darkness so black that only a staccatoed stream was visible. Something was breathing. I wish I could tell you that the construction unearthed something ethereal, a beautiful sleeping giant, an angel, a groundbreaking discovery. But I don't even think it was the construction. I just think she had always been there. Maybe for years she had survived on squirrels or deer. Maybe she thawed during the warm winter. Maybe she was left behind. The first thing I saw was the tattered, jagged tips of wings, bat-like, narrow, dark-veined like bruised plum skin, her pulse visibly pumping through the veins that raised and ripped through the paper-thin skin, stretching over her wings so tightly it seemed painful just to exist, like she wasn't finished yet, like she'd been birthed from the earth prematurely, and she was angry. Her hair was matted in clumps, but where it was free, it was long enough to drag along the ground, slimy and cold and full of dirt, leaves, and dirty snow. Her scalp was suffering. I could see her follicles piercing her scalp, like deceased plant roots, bulbous and swollen. Open sores at her hairline showed what I can only stomach to explain as insect activity. Layers of sick, sheer skin being actively eaten away by a miasma, forehead wrinkles deep and scarred in places. She had no eyebrows or lashes that I could see from my crouched hiding position. Her nose was just a cavity, like a Halloween skull, also swarming with parasites. When she breathed in, a flap rippled across her face, the wetness dripping over her mouth. Her mouth! Years later, an art teacher had told me that while he enjoyed my monstrous horror drawings, that even special effects departments had boundaries, and I would be unlikely to get hired if I didn't tone it down or attempt to make them more realistic. If only he had known I was following his rules, drawing what I knew. She had the familiar sagging of a toothless old woman with flat, cracked, corpse-like lips. But then she parted them. The rot was dizzying. Her gums had been clawed away, scabs and scars and thick bands of roped grayish mauve flesh. Her top and bottom jawbones were not simply bared. They were jagged, layered razors, filed, but not with anything modern or sharp or particularly clean. Time, madness, desperation had filed and shaped that nightmare maw. Makeshift teeth of rocks had been maniacally shoved under the skin, adhered with infection and growth. The entire left side of her face was worn through layer by layer. Her tongue slipped in and out of what could have been her throat, sharp, gaunt collarbones literally piercing through that tissue-like skin, dark, rancid blood pooling in the deep recesses of her collar. She had one misshapen breast. The left side of her chest was deeply scarred and textured, as though it had been burned. Her fingers were bones with jagged talons blackened at the tips. Thick scar tissue marred her shoulders, where her wings took her from somewhat humanoid to monstrous. Scars. Scars everywhere. Rotting wounds dripping larvae and blood onto the frozen ground. I wish I could forget the momentary warmth I felt as urine poured down my legs, immediately freezing and burning, sticking my jeans to my raised and bloody shins. I tore myself away from staring at her long enough to escape. She had chosen her feeding place well. The deep recess of the site was the length of a football field, since that's what the field had once been. High walls of frozen earth surrounded us on three sides. Climbing up in my condition would be impossible. There was a ramp at the far entrance, but I wouldn't have made it past her. Only behind me was the fence I had slammed into on the way in, the creek only a few yards from that, and then a row of backyards of houses that included Dominic's. I had cried then. I cried thinking that only a few minutes away, my best friend was probably getting ready for bed. Then he would always remember the night before he woke up to find out his best friend was dead. He had no idea that my blood was spilling all over the place that we had run and played in. He was warm, with his own mom just feet away. I sobbed, thinking of my own mother. It wasn't the idea of her finding out too, or knowing I would never see her again. It was the guttural, instinctual, painful need for her. It was like being too far underwater and being out of breath, kicking as fast as you can, but knowing you couldn't make it. I needed her, but wouldn't make it to the surface. To her. My sobbing had given me away. That horrible metallic sound reverberated around me, and I remember I was being fed. She was feeding me to something. I had taken a deep breath, bracing myself for the pain, and made for the fence. Before my feet even hit the ground, her claws were in my neck. She flung me further from the trailer and onto the fresh cement that had been poured during the warmer months. I gave up. I'll be honest. I accepted that I was going to die. Then I had heard something unexpected and sickening. Small, furtive movements. Unmistakable vocalizations. Even just from primal grunting and wet groans. I knew it was her young, and I knew it was human. I felt her toxic breath on me before I realized that she had moved. She paused for a second, mapping the wounds she had inflicted so that she could use them again as grips. That was when she dug in so deep into the opening in my shoulder that I could feel her nails and her fingers deep inside the wound. She flung me further across the cement, closer to the sickening, furtive movements. I squeezed my eyes shut. I smelled rancid organic decay and the unmistakable odor of feces. I felt small, fluttering fingers on my neck. Small, little, childlike. I made the inevitable mistake of opening my eyes. I saw dirty blonde hair, tinged with green, draped across a tiny face. Human feet. Baby feet. He was maybe 3, dirty and small, His fingernails were long and sharpened to points. He smiled, and thick mucus stretched across several blackened, sharp teeth. He was missing some, but what remained were crooked, stained and diseased, stuck in purple, rotten gums. Instead of chubby, rosy cheeks, he had hollow, sunken gray skin. The bags under his eyes were purple and veined. Instead of bright, youthful eyes, these were haunted orbs, devoid of color. Faded, milky irises deformed around dark, soulless pupils. He wore what had once been pajamas. Under layers of blood and grime, little trains chugged across his small body in a pattern. The sobs had returned from their hiding place in my chest. I had felt the need to comfort this small, broken doll of a child. That's when he lunged, his broken teeth sinking into my forearm. The pain was unbelievable, bright and loud like the headlights of a truck barreling down on you. I pulled away and heard a horrifying squelching sound as my forearm flesh ripped and hung from his tiny, plump lips. I gagged as he hungrily shoved my skin into his mouth. He ran to the monster, clinging to her body, his stubby hands sinking into her rotten fruit skin. I held my hand tightly against my forearm, watching the blood spill in tributaries between my fingers. It began to snow. Tiny, delicate laceworks fell into and melted against the steaming pool of blood at my feet. A disgusting gurgling sound brought me back, and I watched in horror as the little boy nursed from his mother's surviving breast. Thick blood spilled from the side of his mouth as she gently swept the hair from his face. Years later, I would look up the missing children's database online. I would narrow my search to my state, select the birth year, clumsily guess at the date missing, and it would take me 6 days and 2 breakdowns, but I would find him, along with an inaccurate age progression picture. His parents had named him Mason. He was a twin. He had a baby sister and a dog. He went missing from a family camping trip when he and his brother were 1. But I didn't know any of that when I watched him wash down my flesh with bloody breast milk from a demon I hadn't known existed a few hours earlier. Hours earlier, I'd been at the mall, for Christ's sake. The mall with Charles. I guess remembering my brother's body hanging limply across the steering column had jarred me into action. Knowing he wasn't even a football field away from me got me moving. If I could get over the fence, I could make a beeline for Dominic's backyard. I would just have to jump over the mostly frozen creek to get there. Then I could run to his parents' window and have them call the police. I could see the yellow square in the dark that was the sliding glass door to their kitchen from where I was. If I ran through their house as a shortcut, I could run down their driveway, straight down my street to my house. My heart broke a little as I thought of my parents and my sister beginning to worry about us, as we were only a block away fighting for our lives. But if I got to the far end of the fence before the inclined up, I could get to Charles and keep him safe, keep him warm and talking until the ambulance arrived. Surely somebody had called. The impact on the car was so loud. The other driver surely had a car phone, or maybe a cell phone. Maybe even Yuki's Aikido puppy Moki had heard and was barking up a storm. Maybe the police were already there. For a moment, I thought about grabbing the boy, even if he bit me. I could carry him on my back and get him as far away from her as I could. Maybe even get him home to his family. But even as I stood there, I could barely hold myself up. The world had started to spin around me, blood thickly but steadily pooling on my shoes, my bra, and at the top of my jeans. A few feet from my right lay a rubble pile, not large, but mainly chunks of rebar and concrete. I'd barely made a few inches of progress towards it when a metallic screech again assaulted my senses. My hands covered my ears. I shuffled towards the pile and grabbed a chunk of the rubble, a crude, misshapen, and awkward hammer to wield against the impossible enemy. A rusted, twisted metal handle with a heavy and uneven weight of concrete, hard to hold and even harder to swing. But it was all I had, and I knew it only had to get to the weakest part of her. I only had to incapacitate her long enough to get within earshot of Dominic's house. It couldn't be much past 10 p.m. Someone would have to hear me. I gripped my shoddy weapon tightly to my chest with both hands and felt her swoop down violently as I dove for a cement tunnel, her empty-handed dive throwing her off balance. I scrambled awkwardly towards the far end of the tunnel as I heard her raspy wings pulling her upward before her second strike. Instead of waiting for her to cut me off at the tunnel, I ran as fast as I could, darting from the opening and towards the sickly sweet smell of her nest. The only thing between the fence and me was a bloody baby boy. Blood swirled in my mouth, and a gritty, sharp feeling forced me to spit. I don't know why the image of my tooth and my hand covered in blood triggered a response in me, but it did. I knew I was dying, not just that I was going to die, that this monster my parents had never imagined in their worst nightmares would take their daughter away forever, and they would never see my body or have anything to bury, but that I currently was actively dying. The damage to my ribs, my lungs, my spleen, my arm would kill me if the blood loss or hypothermia didn't do it first. I knew I was dying, and it turned me into a monster too. I ran, not straight for the fence, but for her nest. I could hear her above me, barreling down. I ran right towards that little boy and swung a 20-pound chunk of concrete down on his tiny hand, smashing it to the ground. The sound he made wakes me up at night sometimes. His screams were animal-like, and dropped my weapon to cover my ears. The rusted metal scream from the sky crashed down like a bomb, and I ran. I didn't look back. I ran to the fence. With all the strength I had left, I pulled myself up, shoving my foot into a diamond-shaped hole made by the chain link. I'd hopped 1,000 fences this way in my life, and to this day I'm grateful I had the experience. My bleeding hands found the frozen horizontal pipe at the top of the fence, and groaned in pain as I hefted myself over. All the fence-hopping experience in the world wouldn't have made climbing with shattered ribs and bleeding flanks any less impossible, and I could only crash to the ground. Both ankles jarred into the frozen ground, and my scream stuck in my throat, caught on blood and bile, escaping only as a choking sob. Her violent, crazed screams were still on the ground as she tended to her baby. I didn't let guilt slow me down. I ran as fast as I could for maybe 6 feet before my ankles gave out. Dominic's house was all I could see, a tunnel of black closing in on my vision. I never looked back. I gripped my fingers into the frosty ground, pulling myself up. I hobbled, sprinting towards the dark field. The night sky above me swirled with snow flurries. My busted, bloody fingers fumbled at my jacket zipper. I could see the flickering blue glow of the late-night TV coming from Mr. and Mrs. Rossi's bedroom. The tunnel grew smaller, and I could see less and less. Bawling, I forced my arms out of the jacket as I reached the banks of the creek. Dominic and I had spent summers of our childhood testing the width of the creek along its entirety, and I knew that the bend behind his house was not jumpable. My toes slipped over the crest of the land, and a razor-sharp talon slashed at my hands. I screamed and swung my jacket into the writhing storm of limbs and wings above me. Feeling solid impact on one of the swings, I let go of the jacket and flung myself across the frozen creek, landing with about a foot left, my feet crushing through the glass-thin ice as my ankles crumbled beneath me. I could only see a pinhole in front of me, a flickering blue of TV light. I could hear her above me, diving down, finally, for the kill, her metallic scream and the deafening boom of Mr. Rossi's handgun, the one I'd never even known he had. He was standing on the back porch, one hand over his head, gun pointed to the sky. Mrs. Rossi stood next to me, Dominic's baseball hat in her hand. The last thing I saw was the golden warm glow of the Rossi's kitchen, and the pinhole closing as the world darkened around me. I've read the statement Mr. and Mrs. Rossi gave the police, that they heard what they thought were animal noises behind the house, but when they opened the back door, they heard human screams as well. They saw a large, dark shape in the night, but only a second later they saw my body slumped over, my fingers barely making it to their property. They had called 911, and then my parents. The ambulance had brought my brother and the other driver to the hospital, and it only arrived 30 minutes before mine did. My dad had run to the Rossi's house while my poor, confused, frantic mother rode to the hospital with Cammy and our neighbor. When my dad and I recently recalled the events of that night, I cried hearing the usual funny, goofy man choke up, remembering seeing me slumped over Mrs. Rossi like a rag doll, her white robe covered in my blood. He said that my face was so bruised and swollen that he thought an animal had mauled me. He wasn't exactly wrong. Mr. Rossi had stood guard with the bat until the police and EMTs arrived. Animal control didn't press me too hard. In fact, the vaguer and foggier my memory was, the happier they seemed. I knew that if I told the truth, I'd be locked up, medicated, or assumed to be a victim of something else. A monster woman from the sky. Before I could have even said it out loud, I knew better and feigned memory loss. To this day, the official story is 2 cars on Pondside were struck by a wild animal, and the passenger of one of the cars was attacked and dragged by the animal until a neighbor heard the commotion and fired a gun, scaring it off. While I was in the hospital, a handful of flowers, candles, and teddy bears were left at the stop sign. Charlie doesn't remember anything. He says the last thing he can recall is running to the car in the parking lot and turning the heat on, before pulling the car around for me. I'm actually happy this is the last thing that he remembers. I wonder if he's telling the truth, though. Cammy would come in my room at night for years. She would sit on the floor next to my bed with her fuzzy Disney blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She knew the whole story from beginning to end, even about Mason, a detail I had kept from my parents. Cam and I would stay up together until the sun came up, our eyes locked on the windows in my room, the one facing the south. Some nights, she would get in bed with me, both of us sitting with our backs against the wall, our shoulders resting on one another's, both of us looking at the window, scanning every inch of the blue-gray pitch until morning's first light, searching for a growing speck of black. My parents, proud pacifists, had purchased a gun each, and a few years later they had Cammy and I in judo classes. But the best thing they did was believe me. Even that first night, after the first surgery, they had listened intently, never interrupting or telling me I was imagining things or lying. However, it was made very clear that while our home was a safe space, we weren't to talk about it outside the walls. I know she's still out there. I know Mason is too. Even after I moved away, my mom would send newspaper articles, first clippings in the mail, then eventually links in text messages as time went on. Police blotters about animal attacks, missing dogs, unexplained accidents, missing blonde boys. She took one every few years from different areas, and I thought initially maybe she had killed or eaten Mason once he was too old, until I saw them both one night. I'd heard the whistle, and I didn't even need to look up, but I did. But that's a story for another time. The house was a small, 2-story affair, with white siding on the bottom floor and gray shingles on the top. 3 windows were facing the street, a large picture window, a small rectangular one above that, and another large window below it. I got out of my car and walked towards the door, knocking twice before it opened. A woman stood there, wearing a blue dress with her hair tied back in a bun. She had bright green eyes that seemed to sparkle when she saw me standing outside her house. "Hello," she said cheerfully. Her voice was soft, but carried well through the night air. "Hi, are you Miss Tanner?" She nodded. "Yes, I am." She smiled again and stepped aside so I could enter the house. It smelled odd inside. Not bad or anything like that, just strange, like old books and dust. "Please come in." I entered her living room. It wasn't much more than a couch and a coffee table, an end table with a lamp on it. That's all I really needed for a place to sleep. The walls were painted yellow, which looked nice against the dark furniture. The carpet was black and covered most of the hardwood floors. There was a small kitchen off to the side of the living room with a sink, a stove, and a fridge. Everything was clean and tidy. "Sorry for the mess," she said, while pointing to some boxes stacked in the corner. "My husband died last year, and I just haven't had the time to get around to moving everything yet." "No problem. I don't mind sleeping in a bit of mess." She chuckled. "Well, if you want to put your things away, feel free. Just make sure not to take too long, since I have to leave in a few hours." "Okay, thank you." "You're welcome. I'll be right back." She disappeared down a hallway. As I looked around the room, I noticed something else odd about the house. The walls weren't straight. They bulged outward here and there like they'd been pushed from the inside out by someone, pushing their way through them. It was subtle enough that it didn't bother me at first, but as I looked closer, I realized that it wasn't just the walls. Every single surface in the entire house had these little imperfections, including the ceiling and the floor. I heard footsteps coming down the hall and turned to see Miss Tanner returning with 2 glasses filled with water. She handed me one and took a seat on the couch across from me. "So, what brings you out this way?" she asked as she sipped her drink. "I'm looking for a friend of mine. He went missing in the area about a month ago." "Oh, that's dreadful. What happened?" "He just vanished." I paused as I thought about how to explain. "He was staying in an abandoned hotel nearby and never came back. We think he might have gotten lost in the woods." She shook her head sadly. "That's awful. Is there any chance he survived? Maybe ran away somewhere?" "I don't know. I hope so." She sighed heavily and leaned back on the couch. "I'm sorry. I wish I could help you find him." We sat quietly for a few moments before she spoke up again. "I don't mean to pry, but are you sure he isn't still alive? Maybe he's hiding somewhere or something." "Well, maybe," I said hesitantly. "Do you have any idea where he might have gone?" "I'm not sure, but I have a hunch." She laughed softly and shook her head. "Well, let me know if you hear anything about him. I'll keep my ears open as well." "Thanks. I better get some sleep now," I said, standing up from the couch. "Of course. I'll show you to your room." I downed the glass of water and placed it on the table. Even that seemed crooked. "Thanks again for letting me stay here." "You're more than welcome. Please feel free to use anything in the kitchen if you need anything." "I will." I followed her down the hallway to a staircase leading to the second floor. At the top of those stairs was another hallway that led to 3 doors, one on each side and one at the end. She pointed to the door on the left. "That one's yours. No one else is staying this weekend, so other doors will be locked." She opened the door to my room and flicked a light switch. There was a dresser opposite the bed with a window above it, and a small bed with a nightstand next to it. The wall behind the bed was covered in posters of famous horror movies, slasher flicks mostly. "This should be all set up for you." She motioned towards the bed. "Make yourself comfortable. My room is on the 3rd floor if you need anything." "Thank you. I'll keep that in mind." She walked over to the door at the end of the hall and closed it behind her before disappearing into her own room. I took a look around my room before lying down on the bed. The sheets were clean and smelled nice, but I couldn't tell whether they'd been washed recently or not. As I got under them, I noticed something strange about them. They felt heavy, like they were weighted down on one side. When I tried to lift them up, they wouldn't budge. I rolled over on my back and pulled at them, but still no give. Something was definitely wrong with this place. I lay there staring at the ceiling for a while before drifting off into a deep but restless sleep. I woke up sometime later to a knocking on the other side of my door. I sat up and rubbed my eyes before standing up from the bed. "Who is it?" I called out, walking over to the door. There was no answer. I unlocked the door and cracked it open. It was dark outside, but the moon was bright enough that I could see everything clearly. I stepped out into the hallway and saw nothing except darkness. "Hello?" I called again, but once again there was no response. "Is someone there?" I asked as I turned around slowly. I heard another knock from behind me, and spun around only to catch sight of Miss Tanner standing in the doorway to her room. Her hair had fallen loose from her bun and hung down past her shoulders. She was wearing a white tank top and blue pajama pants with red stripes down them. She looked like she was trying to hide herself by covering her face with her hands, which were pressed against her cheeks. Miss Tanner? She didn't say anything, continuing to stare at me with wide eyes. "Are you okay?" I asked as I approached her. She nodded, but kept her head down. What's happened?" I asked as I reached out to touch her shoulder. She flinched away from my hand and backed up until she hit the wall behind her. Then, without saying a word, she ran down the hallway and disappeared into the shadows. I stood there for several seconds, dumbfounded by what had happened. What the hell had I just witnessed? Was it real? Or was it just one of those dreams or hallucinations brought on by stress or exhaustion? I went back inside my room and locked the door behind me. I grabbed my phone from my pocket and checked the time. It was after midnight. I'd been asleep for hours. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the poster of Friday the 13th hanging on the wall above the desk. Why would Miss Tanner act like that? And why would she try to hide from me when I touched her? It made no sense. I sighed heavily and laid back down on the bed. I wanted to go back to sleep, but I knew I couldn't fall asleep now. Not until I figured out what was going on here. Maybe if I waited long enough, she'd come back out and explain herself. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because suddenly I was shaken awake by someone pounding on the door. "Wake up!" I jumped up from the bed and opened the door to find Miss Tanner standing in front of me, with her hands balled into fists at her side. "What's wrong?" "Get dressed. You have to leave right now," she said frantically as she began to pace back and forth. "Why?" "You don't know how dangerous this place is. Get your things and get out, now." "What are you talking about?" She stopped pacing and looked me dead in the eye. "The house is cursed." "What?" "It's haunted. There are spirits in this house." I laughed nervously and shook my head. "There aren't any ghosts here." "Then what do you call that thing you saw earlier tonight?" "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied. Was she talking about herself? "I'm not leaving until I get some answers." "Please, just go. If you stay here much longer, something bad will happen to you, just like your friend." "My friend?" "Just go," she yelled. She started running downstairs. "Wait," I shouted after her, but it was too late. She was already halfway up the steps before she turned around and glared at me. "Tell me what happened." "He died," she said simply. "How?" "They got him." "Who?" "The monsters." I blinked at her and tried to process what she was telling me. "Monsters?" "Yes, the monsters. They came through the walls and they took him away." "Are you insane?" I screamed at her. "There's no such thing as ghosts or monsters." She frowned at me and shook her head. "There are more things than just that." Then she pointed to the floor below us. "You need to leave right now before they come for you next." "I can't leave. My friend might be here somewhere. He could still be alive." She let out a frustrated sigh and walked over to the window. She pushed aside the curtains and looked outside. The moon was bright enough that I could see everything clearly. I followed her gaze out the window and saw nothing except for darkness. She pulled open the window and leaned out into the night air. "He's leaving," she called out into the darkness. I heard a low growl coming from what sounded like inside the walls. Miss Tanner slowly backed away from the window. Then, without warning, she fell backwards onto the ground. Her body hit the floor with a sickening crunch and didn't move again. I stood there, staring at Miss Tanner's broken form lying on the floor for several seconds, before turning around and sprinting down the stairs. The whole house began to creak and moan, and it appeared as if the walls were closing in on me. I ran past the kitchen and the living room, both of which appeared to be untouched, and headed towards the front door. The only light came from the moon shining through the windows of the hallway. As I approached the exit, I felt something grab hold of my shoulder and pull me back. I spun around quickly to see a figure standing in the shadows behind me. It was tall and thin, with oily skin and long black hair. Its face was covered by a mask made of human bones. I struggled against its grip, but couldn't break free. The walls looked as if they were melting, and more human bone-masked faces were emerging from all around me. surrounding me on all sides and closing in on me until I couldn't breathe. I reached out to touch one of them, but only grabbed hold of empty air. Then suddenly, I was dragged back through the walls, felt myself descending into that pitch-black abyss beneath me. I woke up gasping for breath and sat right up in bed. My heart was racing and my body was soaked with sweat. There was a loud bang on the door and I jumped out of bed. I unlocked the door and opened it slightly, just enough to see who was knocking. But when I did, I wasn't surprised to see Mrs. Tanner standing there with her hands balled into fists at her side. "Get dressed. You have to leave right now." I tried to sleep, but I remembered the black skies, the lightning too. It was all around me. I remembered each flash as time began to blur. Each flash had lit him up that evening, revealing to me the ravages of his face, of his pale, disheveled, decaying body, of the clothes which had ages and ages ago been white, torn now in several places, yellowing and covered in stains. I had shuddered at the sight, tempted to shut my eyes, his eyes too, as they glared and kept glaring at me, through me. Ma hadn't seen him, as always. She had in fact floated right past the rocking chair that had once been his favorite spot to read, but to me, he had never been more real. He had been in the chair that day as well. One doesn't simply abandon an old favorite after all. Hunched over, with limbs bent in awkward ways, and skin clinging onto bones for dear life. A grotesque, formless lump, a shadow. Yet he had been anything but quiet. The rumbling thunder had failed to drown out the sounds of his chattering teeth ringing in my ears. Had I imagined that look in his eyes? Had I imagined his raspy voice trying to call out my name? "Bordoisilla is going home," Ma had whispered, standing by the kitchen window while smiling at the storm outside, at the trees flailing about in answer to the angry wind. I had known that name quite well, known just as well the havoc its owner was famous for wreaking wherever she went. Bordoisilla, the newly married wind spirit, rushing through the towns and villages in her path, eagerly making her way back to her mother on her first trip home from her husband's house. That was the tale, told and retold for centuries within every house in Assam, by wizened old mouths with tobacco-stained teeth, holding the attention of every child sitting there. I had inched closer and closer to Ma, the fear of the ghost getting the better of me, as it often did. Seldom had I seen such peace on her face as I saw at that moment. For the longest time, Ma had continued to look out into our backyard in silence. The wind had cried and howled, so loud I had tugged hard at her stole, insisting upon her presence, squealing to her how he had long been glaring at me. Much like on the occasions gone by, Ma had rolled her eyes. "Not this again," her gaze had seemed to tell me. "Can no one in this house let me have a moment to myself?" Barely turning, she had passed me the bowl soon after, half filled with flattened rice and mashed bananas and bread, along with a glass of water. "Give this to your grandfather. Go on," she said, before turning back to the window. I had no choice. Slowly, my trembling hands had taken the bowl up to him. I remember those skies very well. I remember them as a 10-year-old, when he too had at last traveled homeward one night. Death had come for my grandfather, almost begrudgingly, one would think, in his sleep, close to a year after that stormy April evening. Strangely enough, I remember them best now, when most other things are hard to remember. All the faces, the names, the numbers, when the grays and whites mingle in my matted hair as I lie in bed, every day dragging on longer than a year. I can feel my form shrinking to nothing. I can feel the wind outside growing stronger. I know what you must be thinking. What a horrible person. I know. I've thought it too. The fact I'm genuinely thinking about sending away my dog makes me feel pretty guilty. Then I remember what he's been doing, and my guilt is replaced with fear. This started about a month ago. I came home early from work one day, absolutely furious, and clutching a parting gift from my boss. My Christmas bonus was a ham or something. I sighed with a hand pressed firmly against my throbbing temple and placed the mystery meat in the fridge. The pounding behind my eyes got more and more intense until I leveled my fist and punched the fridge. The throbbing in my head didn't go away, but there was a new guest, as it was now accompanied by the pain in my knuckles. I let out a deep sigh that was childish. It was at that moment that Rufus came padding in, his big brown eyes gazing up at me, as if wondering what that noise had been. "Your dad was pretty dumb just now," I said, crouching down to run my hands across his thick fur. He wagged his tail and let out an excited noise as I petted him. I raised my eyebrows. I wish I could just curl up in a ball and chill like you do. Rufus, of course, paid no mind to this, and after realizing he wouldn't be receiving more pets, padded away back to his comfortable bed. I rolled my eyes and took a deep breath. While disappointing, this whole Christmas bonus thing wasn't the end of the world. Sure, my boss was an evil prick, but I had a whole 2 weeks of paid vacation stored up, and he couldn't stop me from using it. So, screw him. I'm gonna relax and spend my vacation doing whatever I want. How about it, Rufus? Wanna do nothing? I asked loudly. Rufus simply yawned. It was the next morning that I discovered that the mystery meat was still in my fridge. I peeled back the wrapped paper to see a red mass bundled in saran wrap. I furrowed my brow. Gotta be beef. Rufus sat at my side, eagerly waiting. I'm not a butcher. How would I know what it is? I'll just fry it? Everything tastes good fried with onions. I leaned down and booped Rufus's snoot. I bet you would taste good fried with onions, too. He agreed as his tail wagged back and forth. Well, don't you have a high opinion of yourself? I cut off a large chunk of the mystery meat and threw it in a pan with onions, salt, pepper, and butter. I hope you taste good, Christmas bonus, because you don't really look that great. I probably talk to myself too much. Having a full conversation probably isn't healthy. I raised my eyebrow and decided to turn on the TV for my own sanity. It blinked on to a cooking channel. I glared at the TV. Don't you shame me. Then I flipped to the news and got right back to frying the beef. Thoughts and prayers go out to the victims and families of the late... I looked down at the large mass of beef left over. Hey, Rufus, I picked up a raw slab. Want something to chew on? He dashed on over like any dog would when presented with a hunk of meat. All right, you want it? Sit, I commanded with my most authoritative voice. Rufus gave no care, lunging upward and snagging it from my hand. Hey, I said, laughing. That was rude. Rufus took one last look at me before tearing into the beef with vigor. Still chuckling to myself, I once again turned back to the news. The search is still on for Maya Kelling, a local who was reported missing on December 14th by her boyfriend. She was in the Beluva area, and anyone with information is encouraged to call this number. I shut it off. The news is so depressing. Rufus paid me no mind, as he continued munching away with that playful ferocity of a domesticated animal. I took a deep breath and went to have a smell of the beef. It smelled god-awful. Jesus, what did I do to this thing? There was something deeply off-putting about that smell. It didn't smell rotten or decayed. It smelled foreign. It filled me with apprehension and a strange sense of dread. I shook my head and felt a wave of stupidity roll over me. The feeling was not too dissimilar when you were watching a scary YouTube video at night by yourself and you want to turn the lights on. I felt like a little bitch, but the feeling of nervousness and the fact that no one but me would judge me for throwing all this meat out made my decision easy. This was going straight into the garbage. I threw it in and did my utmost to forget about it. Take out it is. Having stuffed myself with pizza, I crashed hard. I'm a heavy sleeper, so it takes a lot to wake me up. Yet, I was woken up. A loud crash echoed through my bedroom as I shot bolt upright and listened for a moment. I heard dragging noises. My heart pounded in my chest. I stood, having armed myself with my pistol. I took a couple of careful steps forward. The noise became more distinguished. There was a gnawing and an eager snort. A sense of dread filled me as I rounded the corner, expecting the worst. "Rufus!" I shouted, seeing an absolutely devastating mess. He had torn open the trash, and it was scattered everywhere. I groaned and slumped my shoulders. "Not only did you scare the crap out of me, I'm also gonna have to clean up your friggin' mess. Come on, man." Rufus had pillaged what he was looking for and scampered off without even looking at me. Having fully cleaned up the mess, I stood up and stretched, cracking my back in a few places. "You're an ass for that," I said as I washed my hands. "I'm going back to bed. Good night. Love you," I trailed off. Rufus was sitting on his bed, gnawing on something. "Hey, what do you have there?" I walked forward and reached down. To my great surprise, it was the first time I was greeted by a low growl. "Hey now," I said, my words barely making it out of my throat because of the immediate surprise and fear. I took a few steps back and knelt down to get a good view of what he was gnawing on. The mystery meat. I reached forward tentatively and got met with the same low growl as before. "Rufus, come on, give me that. I think it's bad." But what Rufus did next sent a chill down my spine. He simply stopped gnawing on it and stared me dead in my eyes. No more movement, no tail wagging, nothing. I must have sat there for 30 seconds before I did anything. I stood up, forcing myself to turn around despite every single fiber of my being telling me not to take my eyes off of him. "Fine, have it your way." I couldn't help but take a peek over my shoulder as I walked away. He sat motionless, his eyes still locked onto mine. I turned on my light and closed my door, lying in bed until my eyes got too heavy to keep open. After waking up, it took a few seconds to recollect the night before. When I did, I fully opened my door to reveal Rufus curled up in a ball. He was curled up in his dog bed, fast asleep. I felt the weary tension within me wither away. "I need to get out of the house," I muttered. I came home that night to a dark abode. Having been drinking, my bearings were slightly askew, and I found myself fumbling with my keys a bit. As I pushed open the door to my house, I was greeted by an unfriendly darkness that settled itself over an empty house. I pawed for the light switch for a moment, until I found it, flipping it on with my one hand. "Crap!" I cried in fear, as my gaze was met by a great black mass standing in the middle of the living room. It wobbled slightly, as if unsure of its footing, before it fell to all fours. "Rufus?" I cried, my heart playing in my ribcage like a bongo. What the hell were you doing, you creepy-ass mutt?" Rufus just stared, tail stationary, eyes fixated on me. I'm gonna go relax." "Cut that out." Rufus didn't blink. Neither did I. I slammed my door closed and sat on the edge of my bed, taken aback. Jesus, that was friggin' scary. As I took off my shoes, the image of the shadows in the dark, form stretched in a way it wasn't supposed to, made my skin crawl. I've seen dogs standing up before, but in that goofy cute way. Hell, I've even seen dogs do a headstand. But this, standing in the middle of the room in the dark, just staring at the door, it unsettled me to my core. My sleep was troubled, as if I had a nightmare I couldn't quite remember. I woke up to that feeling of unease creeping its way back up my spine. To stall, I scrolled through the news, but nothing could take my mind off of it. Not Bitcoin plunging in value, not the disappearance of that local girl, not Taco Bell bringing back the nacho fries. I just kept imagining what Rufus must be doing at any given moment. standing there. Just standing there. I growled and punched my pillow. I'm acting like a wuss. Gotta get up. I rolled out of bed and crept to my door, heart pounding. I stared at the handle and reached my hand out slowly, my heart beginning to thump against my chest at an increased tempo, with a deep breath that caught in my chest as I eased the door open. I felt fear jolt through my body as I saw him, standing once again in the middle of the living room, his furry back to me, as he stood absolutely motionless, staring at the wall. My words caught in my throat before I could speak. I did the worst possible thing I could have possibly done, and quietly closed the bedroom door. The fear began to set in worse. I locked my door and collapsed on my bed, breathing fast. He was out there, standing upright. I couldn't open that door again. I couldn't make it out of the house. Not with him there. Not with him just standing there. I found myself nauseous with terror that had possessed my body. I sat there staring at the door for the better part of an hour, before finally getting up the courage to once again check outside. I crept closer, each footfall on the soft carpet surely giving me away to the keen ears of Rufus. My heart pounded in near apoplectic terror as I once again laid my hands on the knob. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to open the door. Once it did, I peered through the crack to try and see where he might be. Still standing. Trying my best to summon fury, I opened the door wide and shouted, "Rufus!" All the anger I summoned was turned into terror vapors when Rufus slowly turned his head to face me. He turned his body next. He took a step. He took another one. And another. I screamed in horror as he began marching towards me, off kilter, one step at a time. I once more slammed the door and locked it, stumbling backwards in panic. I didn't hear a sound at my door, but I saw the shadow of something standing there. "Rufus, stop it right now!" It was met with silence again. I was met with a terrible sound. It sounded like when a dog yawns and their voice stretches and bends. But this had purpose. This wasn't just a noise. It was measured, meaningful. "Get out of my house!" I screamed in terror as it continued. "Get out now!" The sound stopped. The shadow at my door was slowly and clumsily plodding away. I shook, my breath coming in gasps. I stayed awake in my room for the rest of the day, until finally thirst gripped me and I couldn't bear it any longer. I left the room, armed with the small pistol I keep for safety. There he was, curled up in his dog bed, fast asleep. I kept my eyes locked on him as I tiptoed around, gathering food and water before dashing to my room. I type this now to you, asking the community of people who deal with these things. If I call the cops, they'll call animal control. They'll either laugh in my face or simply take Rufus. I don't want that. I want my Rufus back, my good boy. What's happening to him? Why is he like this? I knew a man once named Dr. Ford Ashley. He was a brilliant biochemist and my mentor for the better part of 3 years. When I met Dr. Ashley in June of 2005, he was a character to behold. He stood at 6 foot even and was as thin as a pencil. He had very pale skin and a very slight, consistent cough. He greeted me in his lab with a smile and a weak handshake before coughing into a white handkerchief that seemed to always be in his hand. By this point, I had completed most of my schooling and was looking for an expert to help hone my skills and start my own lab someday. Ford, as I had come to call him, was at first very introverted. He told me about the things he was getting paid to work on and taught me various techniques to make things faster and easier. It wasn't until November of 2005 that I started to learn more about him and his personal goals. Whenever there was free time in the lab, he would be searching for cures to various degenerative respiratory diseases. He was a visionary when it came to this, always knowing the outcome before asking the question, it seemed. Around the anniversary of when I started with Ford, I began to learn his true motivations. Up until this point, it seemed that Ford had spent nearly all of his time in the lab. I would sometimes leave late in the night and return early the next morning, only to find him still toiling away. He never seemed to need to sleep. It was July of 2006 when that slight cough got significantly worse, to the point that he began leaving red and black splotches on the handkerchief. I asked him about it one day, and he would only say that it was a bad cold or some other common ailment. I walked into the lab one morning in late July and noticed that Ford wasn't there. This had never happened before. I'd always either met him there or, more commonly, found him there working. I called his name and got no answer. I didn't think much of it, so I started getting ready for the day, checking the equipment and whatnot, when I noticed that the door next to his office was slightly ajar. I went to the door and called out for Ford once more. As I opened the door, I saw the crumpled form of Dr. Ashley lying on the floor, blood and black ooze pooling around his head. I rushed to him and propped him up in a chair, and thankfully he woke up. I asked what had happened, and he asked for a glass of water. I saw that I could get no further questions at this time, so I got him some water and went out to get us breakfast across the street. To my surprise, the day carried on as normal from there. When we were getting ready to lock up the lab that night, Ford explained the details of his condition. Since he was a kid, Ford was near constantly sick. Never anything major. He never went to the doctor. It was always just a slight, dull, ill feeling, as he described it. The most notable symptom was an ever so slight cough, near imperceptible if you weren't looking. Steadily, the ailment worsened. Not extremely, just taking more physical forms. When he was about 20, the cough became more prominent, and his skin became a sickly shade of pale. He said it felt like his bones became frailer as well, though he never got it tested. Those worsening conditions fueled Ford's interest in the medical field. He went to school for years, studying anything and everything he could. He went to doctors, though none of them saw anything specifically wrong with him. Dr. Ashley became cynical of the outside world, starting a life of seclusion and deciding that he would be the only one who could save himself. That was, I suppose, until he met me. After learning this, we both took some time off. We came back to the lab in August of 2006, though I suspect that Ford had been there all along. Very soon after we got back into the swing of things, Ford clued me in on his plan. What I'm about to tell you will sound like some nonsensical science fiction, but Ford somehow had made a working prototype. His plan was to counteract his body's weakness, which he found out was some sort of rapid cell decay, by absorbing the essence of living things. Ford rolled back his sleeves to show me how it was done. Tubes now ran like lines of veins down his arm. He took off his shirt to reveal that the tubes ran out of his back as they plunged into a sort of grinder-like device. The device could be handheld, and it had a large enough opening to fit a coconut. At first, Ford would leave it on his desk somewhere, and whenever he was feeling particularly ill, he would plug it in and feed it a houseplant or two. I was terrified of the machine for some reason. It somehow felt cold and distant, not just because it was an inanimate machine, but in a way that only a severely depraved human could feel cold and distant. A bit of time passed on like that, and I got used to it. It was now April 2007, and Ford seemed healthier than ever. He got rid of the handkerchief, and even started going for walks at the local park whenever he had a chance to get away from the lab. He seemed happy for a change. Then, all of a sudden, his condition rapidly started to deteriorate. He ended up worse than he had started, skin beginning to dry up in patches and fall off completely. He was coughing near constantly, and half the time blood was coming up. He could barely stand. Here's where I did the first of a few terrible things to come. Ford collapsed once again and his breathing was ragged. I could tell he would die if I didn't do something soon. I plunged him into the machine and threw some plants into it, but it did nothing. My mind raced, and all of a sudden, my feet carried me over to the lab and down the hall. There was another lab that tested beauty products in the small building. I went to that lab and grabbed a rat. I don't know how I did exactly what I did next, but I threw the rat into the jaws of that awful machine. Ford perked up a moment later, thanking me profusely, then consoling me. He said it was a necessary evil, and at the time, I believed him. We got back to work for a few days when, for the first time ever, Dr. Ashley actually wasn't there. I searched around for him, but I didn't see him. Everything was locked up properly, and I noticed that the machine was gone. Ford didn't show up all day, but I got a decent amount of work done regardless. The next day, Ford apologized for his absence and said he had a family emergency he had to tend to. I didn't think anything of it. Midway through the day, Ford asked if I wanted to go on a walk in the local park. He said he'd found a pretty spot overlooking a large field. I told him I would, though we'd probably be gone for the rest of the day, as the park was a very large nature preserve. Ford was adamant and said we could take the rest of the day off. So off we went into the woods of the park and began to climb up a mountain. I hadn't had too much time to explore this place as a kid, so I was following every twist and turn as Ford took them. It started to get late when I noticed that Ford wasn't carrying the machine. I don't know how I hadn't noticed this, but I assumed it was at his house or something. Slowly, day becoming night, just as we got to the mouth of a cave, I had a very uneasy feeling at this point. But Ford somehow convinced me that if we were lost, we could spend the night in the cave. It was a fairly tight squeeze to get in, the entrance maybe 3 feet tall, and it was decently well hidden behind hanging moss. I wondered how Ford had been able to spot this. The mouth of the cave looked unstable, like any sudden force or any sort of weight behind it could collapse the whole thing. My eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, and I saw horrors I couldn't believe. I saw bloodied and torn up bones, hunks of flesh and blood splattered everywhere, and handprints on the wall. I tried to let out a scream, but my mouth wouldn't open. "Why are you so scared?" a crazed voice echoed through the darkness. "Can't you see? This is progress. You helped me make everything I ever wanted. This is all because of you." I ran for the exit as I heard and saw the machine hum to life. I looked back to find Ford already upon me. I managed to dodge out of the way enough so that his attack only grazed my leg. But he still managed to saw a chunk of meat clean off the leg. I pushed and punched at him, maybe a few times. It's hard to remember, but I managed to make some distance. I sprinted for the cave entrance and jumped out into the cold night air. I slammed at the entrance to the cave as I heard the whirring of gears come closer at a rapid pace. Finally, the rocks began to fall, sealing off the cave with piles and piles of loose earth. The device that Ford had wielded shifted from a brilliant man's magnum opus, his font of life, to a hungering steel maw devoid of any emotion. I don't know for sure how many people he had killed. Ford had been overtaken by lunacy. He had become nothing more than an animal whose only goal was survival. I sometimes pity the man to this day, even after all he did, as he didn't fail in the end. The maw became too hungry, and when I unsealed the cave I had trapped him in for days, the machine had eaten most of his body. It was either wholly gone or shredded beyond recognition. No one knew who Dr. Ashley was or that he had even died. At least until now, I suppose.